June 19, 1944 begins as a line on a board and a rumor in the air, and by dusk it will be a moving picture that everyone on Task Force 58 can recite beat for beat. Far out ahead of the carriers, destroyer pickets ride the morning chop like punctuation marks on the Pacific, their SG radars leaning into the curvature of the sea. The first plots are faint, pips that seem more hope than metal. Then they steady and multiply. Bearings are called in with voices that sound bored on purpose. Combat information centers, dim rooms lit by repeaters and grease pencils, start stitching those bearings into tracks, the way a surgeon turns sporadic pulses into a diagnosis. The message climbs the net and lands in the calmest sentence in naval aviation. Fighters launch. Hellcats rise in 4-plane sections, then knit into divisions until the sky looks like the underside of a chessboard. Flight leaders don't shout. They set the pace with headings and altitudes, stack in cap at 10, 15, 20,000 feet in layers that feel like a safety deposit vault. The F6F does not climb like a racer or turn like a rumor. It climbs like something that means what it says. Pilots check their mixtures, bump superchargers as the air thins, and settle into an economy of movement that training hammered into them back at Jacksonville, Glenview, and Miramar. A Hellcat cockpit is a classroom with consequences. The syllabus never forgot that enemies shoot back. The first wave coming from Ozawa's carriers is big enough to deserve a capital letter. Dive bombers with escorts, torpedo planes scraped from surviving air groups, and Zeros that still look elegant right up to the second they meet a high-side pass they didn't see coming. Fighter directors take the destroyer's plots, correct for the way ships move under you even when you pretend the ocean is a runway, and vector divisions into intercepts with an accountant's cadence. Angels 20, steer 315, bogies bearing 080, range 70. 70 miles is a lifetime in air combat if you own the picture. It is a minute and a half if you don't. The engagement opens with the sound of self-control. Hellcat leaders push over just enough to trade altitude for speed without turning themselves into diving bricks. They do not chase. They do not get low. They take high-side runs that cut across the Japanese formations at oblique angles, 6 guns speaking in short, mean sentences. The F6F's ruggedness, thick wings, stout landing gear, armor behind the pilot, shows up as indifference to punishment, which is a way of saying pilots trust the airplane enough to focus on gunnery. Tactics drilled at the fleet replacement air groups come back like muscle memory. Section integrity above heroics. No fixating on a burning target. No rolling in flat where a Zero's elevator can ambush your tail. Instructors once smacked knuckles on chalkboards to make these points. Today, the enemy will do it for real if you forget. From the CICs, the picture looks clean, because men in headphones and khaki make it clean. They call for splits and recombines, hand Hellcat divisions off like baton passes, and log kills without triumph because there are more tracks behind the first. Picket destroyers correct bearings as the bogies make doglegs around clouds or wobble into the wind. The fighter directors account for those small sins and keep the intercept geometry honest. The phrase that repeats on circuit after circuit is high, high, high. The old lesson, altitude is life insurance, accrues interest every minute. On the Japanese side, surprise arrives in layers. Pilots accustomed to slipping past early radar with cloud and cunning discover that the Americans already occupy the angles that used to be paid for with fuel and nerve. Formations try to push through the first Hellcat cuts and reform. The second wave of passes scatters them into individual problems. Escort Zeros, who attempt to climb and turn into the fight, find that turn fighting up high against a heavier, faster airplane flown with section discipline is not the same duel they trained for in 1940-41. If a Zero gets behind a Hellcat, the standard escape is not a prayer. It's a dive. Nose down, throttle forward, ride the Hellcat's weight and clean lines toward thicker air and higher numbers until the pursuer shears off, reluctant to follow a heavier plane into a speed band where control surfaces feel like stone. Dive recovery discipline. The boring practice of not pulling too hard too soon, of trimming and counting to let compressibility ease before you yard on the stick, saves wings and men in moments where adrenaline begs for poor choices. The first inbound strike never sees U.S. decks. The closest many attackers get is a sea horizon that refuses to yield anything but cap contrails and the occasional reflection that might be a ship or might be the sun betraying your hope. The Hellcats ripple through them with 650 salvos that break planes at the spar or tear engines off their mounts. Pilots who survived Guadalcanal and Solomons remember Zeros coming apart like lacquered kites. Today, the targets include Judy and Jill and Val derivatives, each a different silhouette that the Fleet Air Arm identification cards made men learn backwards and by flashlight. Gunners in the American formations carry their own rules. No long bursts, 2 seconds for a sure shot, 1 second to correct a mistake, then throttle through and climb back to your perch. If you shoot all your ammunition at the first screaming target, your next enemy is your own emptiness. Out on the flank of the battle where the ocean hides submarines better than it hides carriers, 2 U.S. boats execute perfect ambushes that have nothing to do with cap, but everything to do with the day's result. USS Albacore puts a torpedo into Taihō, Ozawa's newest, proudest deck, at a moment when fuel vapor handling is about to become a morality tale. Damage control should be a religion. On Taihō, it becomes a series of bad choices and worse airflow. Hours later, Taihō is a rumor, then a memory, then a slick. USS Kavala finds Shōkaku and nurses a solution until it's not a solution but a verdict. Multiple hits, fires, then the slow, sickening cant that says a carrier is going to the bottom and taking her ready room with her. Those 2 sinkings remove not just decks, but the spaces where expertise lives. Workshops, signal rooms, ops tables, and the habitual routes experienced men walk between them. It's harder to replace a ready room than a fuselage factory knows. Over Guam and Rota, land-based reinforcements try to lift into the same sky that is already a U.S. picture. Fighter directors and liaisons knit the island plots into the fleet's plot, and the intercepts feel unfair in the way that war looks when one side has taught itself to be an information animal. Hellcats cut up climbing formations before they reach their altitude gates. Anti-aircraft batteries on the islands add a buzzsaw fringe as pilots who have never flown through a standing flak pattern realize that black puffs aren't random. They're fences. Those who make it out toward the seas discover that the cap layers renew themselves like tide lines. The phrase, "about 500 planes vanished," is the kind of shorthand aviators use to avoid counting in public. The logs will show the day in smaller, truer numbers, and still leave the impression that the sky voted unanimously. On the decks themselves, The tempo is a machine. Launch, recover, respot, refuel, rearm, launch again. The choreography of Essex-class flight operations is a thing men could write poetry about if they weren't too superstitious to jinx it. Plane captains run with hoses, ordnance crews hoist belts and bombs with a rhythm that respects fingers. LSO paddles look like feathers from a distance and like court orders up close. One of the day's quieter miracles is that the carriers do not produce their own casualties by impatience. Deck cycles are aggressive and exact, not frantic. Lessons paid for in 1942 and 1943 are now doctrine. No heroics on rollout, never block the landing area, never argue with an arresting wire. A Hellcat that takes a hit and limps back to a deck enters a system designed to let a pilot live and fly again after coffee. The F6F's statistics are not abstractions to the men who measure them with breath. 6 M2 Brownings mean that a 2-second burst lays a lattice of tracer and lead that can saw a wing from a spar. Self-sealing tanks and cockpit armor proof the airframe against the first bad surprise and the second. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 is an engine that forgives errors down low and delivers honesty up high. A rugged landing gear permits hard recoveries on decks stained with salt spray and oil without bending into theater. For every engineering drawing that made those truths measurable, there is a pilot who flies differently because he believes them. Confidence is not a number. It is a behavior. Opposite the confidence is a deficit that Japan cannot pay down in a day. The Zero remains a graceful killer in the right envelope, but its missing armor, unprotected fuel, and thin wings are choices from a different war. Choices that made perfect sense when pilots were aces and opponents were green, and that make less sense when the opponent has built an airplane for a late-war sky and trained pilots to use it as a team. Veteran Japanese aviators are the thread holding units together. When they go down, through tracer webs, through flak fences, through mistakes made in unfamiliar intercept geometries, no pipeline replaces them at speed. American training commands are industrial artifacts, standard syllabi, check rides that mean the same thing in different zip codes, radio procedures that translate across ships and time zones. Japanese training is brave and improvisational in a time that demands repetition and mass. Inside the fighter direction rooms, the day is not emotional. Plots move, vectors change, sections check in and check off with the discipline of men who never want to say everything on the air. Controllers break planes into free and hold groupings to avoid starving the cap of altitude by sending everyone to the first flashing location. Bearing drift, how much your target's motion changes relative angles while you talk, gets accounted for automatically by men whose hands move grease pencils like metronomes. One destroyer's radar picture degrades in rain clutter. Another, 10 miles offset, cleans it up, and the net fills the hole. The edges of the system are fuzzy and still unforgiving. A single bad assumption can send a division the wrong way. But the system has redundancy and modesty, two virtues underplayed in war stories. When a controller isn't sure, he says so, and another controller fills the blank with a different view. The Hellcat vs. Zero duel that textbooks love is only one channel in a larger broadcast. Dive bombers flying in loose Vs, torpedo planes skimming with torpedoes that beg for steady runs, escorts that must choose between shepherding and fighting. Each of these problems is different, and the F6F is the right common denominator. Energy fighting is not dogma here. It is insurance. A division leader calls, "High left slash, don't get low." The section slides through a bomber box, clips a wing, and does not hang around to watch the splash. Every second spent rolling level to watch a kill is a second spent inviting entropy to sit on your tail. What the day refuses to be is lucky. The lines that make it look lucky, radar seeing far, directors speaking clearly, pilots executing simply, are the payoff for 2 years of work. After Pearl Harbor, the Navy wrote syllabi for things that had been taught by ghost stories. Section integrity became a thing you could score on. Gunnery stopped being feel and started being tables and tracers. Dive recovery discipline went from rumor to checklist. The Combat Information Center evolved from a desk to a doctrine. When the Marianas campaign opened, all of that process was ready to be stress-tested by an enemy who did one thing better than anyone: attack with ferocity. A small irony of June 19th is that ferocity makes a good lab partner for good process. You get clean data fast. Somewhere between the second and third inbound waves, a young pilot looks down and realizes he has never actually seen a U.S. carrier today. Only the air around it, the stacks of cap, the slices of interception, the tops of clouds where people lift and vanish. The fleet below him is an assumption backed by trust. That is new. In earlier years, pilots had to see the deck to feel safe. Today, feeling safe is a function of hearing a voice that has the plot, seeing your section leader's wings stable in your peripheral vision, and knowing that if you ride your altitudes, you will receive another vector before you need to ask for one. The abstraction of war, trust in systems and strangers, hardens into habit. By late afternoon, the ledger looks cruel. Ozawa has launched waves that die on vectors and in flak, and in the long blue corridor between Guam's shoreline and the American pickets. 2 fleet carriers have gone down to submarines that never once hailed anyone. Land-based reinforcements have been savaged. The American decks have not been touched in a way that matters. The pilots who slide into the groove for recovery smell cordite and salt, and something else, rubber cooked by catapult shoes, and their hands still shake no matter how many times they flex fingers. On the signal bridge, the Admiral accepts numbers with the same expression he used when the day was still a rumor. He knows that what was validated today is not a new airplane. It is a way of thinking that has turned mass production into a tactic. The kill ratio that historians print later will look like a typo to people who first read it in newspapers. It is not magic. Aircraft production matters, but the relevant curve is pilot production and pilot seasoning. The U.S. pipeline does not only make aviators, it makes standards. Japanese losses today are not frightening for the metal. They are frightening for the names. Leaders, instructors, the men who know how to land on a rolling deck when the wind gods decide to criticize. America can replace airframes by the 100, it can replace pilots by the dozen. And because it can keep decks cycling and squadrons topped up, it can teach good pilots to become better ones while fighting. Japan cannot afford the slope of that learning curve, not anymore, not after today. Night threatens, and with it a different set of routines. Nightcap and pickets shift, search radars change tolerances, and the fighter directors alter their language because distances make different kinds of mistakes, likely in the dark. The day has been a demonstration that light and altitude favor a fleet, that learned to vector and to hold fire until the picture is right. The night will be a reminder that even victors must respect physics. Planes that stayed up too long come home with fuel needles whispering. LSO paddles glow. On approach, pilots talk less and listen more. Aboard one carrier, a maintenance crew pulls a Hellcat tail cone and finds shrapnel caged in the structure like a trapped animal. They drop it into a bucket and keep working. A plane captain tapes a bullet hole and writes the time, as if noting the hour will let him argue with fate later. An ordnance man counts links and does not cheat. Cheating gets men killed tomorrow. On a destroyer, a radar operator rubs his eyes and sees after-images of pips in his coffee. In a CIC, an officer folds the day's plot and slides it into a folder that will outlive the ship and the men and the war, because paper is a kind of stubbornness. Somewhere on the surviving Japanese carriers, a pilot who flew through the day and returned wonders what he did wrong and knows the answer is unfair. He did not do everything wrong. He was brave. He navigated. He kept formation until formation no longer meant anything. What he could not do was fly inside a system that gave him altitude, picture, and relief. His commanders could not cough up replacement planes and crews at the rate the Americans burned ammunition. He thinks about the moment American tracers stitched across his windscreen and about how quickly the sky went from crowded to empty. He does not know the phrase turkey shoot yet. He knows that the sky was stingy. The phrase, about 500 planes vanished, will bother pedants and please publicists. The real number will be smaller and no less decisive. Vanishing is the right verb, because what disappeared was not only aircraft, it was the remainder of an air arm's confidence that it could impose tempo. U.S. radar and fighter direction systems collapsed the distance between detection and solution until Japanese airmen were spending their courage in bad geometry. The Hellcat's ruggedness and firepower converted those solutions into kills fast enough to keep the deck cycles safe. Submarines took away the decks that could have recovered the fragments of the day. Land-based reinforcements charged into the same net because the net was wider than any one carrier could perceive. Every thread in that net had been spun in 1942 and 1943, and on June 19th it became visible enough to trace with a finger. The day does not end with a trumpet. It ends with checklists. Planes are chalked and chained, guns are safed and bore-swabbed. Pilots sign debriefs that reduce panic and relief to ranges and headings, and occasionally a sentence that sneaks in and makes a room quiet. A few men write names in margins and then scratch them out because there is no box on the form for how it felt to watch a wingman vanish. Radios go quiet in a way that feels like sleep. The ocean looks the same as it did at dawn. The difference is that now everyone in this moving city knows what kind of day it was. Not a lucky one, but a day that paid out on doctrine, on radar, on factory schedules and syllabi, on the practice of stacking advantages until the other side runs out of ways to plan around them. In the weeks that follow, America will speak about the Marianas turkey shoot in language that sounds like carnival and scoreboard. Those phrases will sound wrong to men who were there because they miss the responsibility in the work. The responsibility is what lingers. A Navy that learned faster did not win because it found a miracle airplane or stumbled into a perfect storm. It won because it turned information into altitude, altitude into angles, and angles into outcomes without burning up pilots faster than it could teach them. Japan, whose early war air arm had once been the frightening standard, could not replace the expertise it spent, and by the time it understood how much the picture had changed, its ability to change with it was gone. June 19th is therefore not an accident. It is a milestone on a road built of check rides, briefs, and production lines that never slept. The Hellcat deserves its laurels, but so do the men in CICs with pencils, the controllers who spoke like accountants, the picket destroyers that drew lines on the sea with radar, the submarine captains who did their deadly math in 3 dimensions, and the machinists in distant states who kept Pratt and Whitney's roaring on the first try. If you want to remember the day without lying to yourself, keep the image of a quiet fighter director, one hand on a headset, eyes on a scope, vectoring another division with a voice that makes distance and fear into trigonometry. Keep the image of a Hellcat sliding across the nose of a formation and firing for 2 seconds, then climbing back to the gate, because that is what the book says, and because the book was written in blood and patience. Keep the simple truth that 500 planes didn't vanish. They were found, outthought, outflown, and outproduced. And in that, a long air war ended in an afternoon, not because fate chose a side, but because one side turned learning into a weapon and never stopped sharpening it.